Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today I am very pleased to be joined by a friend of mine who has oftentimes, in his capacity as a media analyst, spoken on the issues pertaining to YouTube, and it might be that we get to that as well. But today, in fact, we are going to be focusing on a more pressing issue, that is for the public rather than people who are operating in the YouTube sphere, and that is the nature of propaganda and modern American university education. My friend, after a bit of a hiatus, had decided to return to university, and what ended up welcoming him was not an education, but sheer, unadulterated, and pure propaganda. So let me thank him for being with me again. I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, what was the first sign upon returning to university that you were in fact not receiving an education in the sense of a balanced perspective on a variety of viewpoints, etc., but rather a very specific line of inquiry, if we want to be generous, if not outright propaganda or brainwashing?
Thank you. Of course, it's always a pleasure to be here talking with you. As you mentioned in your intro, I've been in and out of the college system in the United States quite a few times now, and each time it's different, especially over really the last decade I've been doing this. And you can see shifts in the narratives they want to impose on the students there, across the years, and they do change, just like the political narratives in the United States. Now, my most recent cycle, I would say, the most indicative, and we actually can explore this, was when I was going around just observing the student organizations who had presented themselves trying to attract new members. And one thing about student organizations are, to their credit, they're mostly run by their students. But I mean, if you go to talk to them, the people running those student organizations, you'll find that often they have very little to do with the title themselves. So, for example, one such organization, speaking very vaguely, I went and discussed their organization with them because it seemed interesting to me. The organization being teaching English as a second language to people abroad, and of course, the real purpose of that student organization was to teach and help bring in refugees and immigrants from various countries to the United States and instruct them in English. And now my thought would have been more along the lines of something that you had done in your past, which is going and teaching English in Hagwon in South Korea, but that clearly was not the purpose. The purpose was to help Somalians integrate. And it wasn't even just limited to that. So, for example, there was a geography club as well, and it had very, very little to do with geography, but rather serving the refugee resettlement, and I won't call it an industrial complex, but you can call it a complex nevertheless. I mean, that was the purpose of it. The purpose of it was to hang out as friends while assisting in resettling refugees, for whatever that means in terms of geography. And so you can see it's very interesting. You see the students who are staffing these and self-directing these organizations completely of their own volition, pushing what I would argue centrally created political narratives and directives created by think tanks across the country. Here they are, implementing it loyally in something similar to the Red Guards in China, completely of their own volition. So that probably was my first rude awakening upon returning. But obviously it had been this way. I mean, anyone who you can speak to who's been in any school system, whether it's public, university, or private, it's been this way for a long time. I mean, people rightly say, even your most boring conservatives rightly say, that the education in the United States is very much a bastion of the left.
But I think it's fair to say that as much as it had been the left for a few decades now, it's rapidly shifted to the furthest elements possible of the left, which is to say, when I went to university, yeah, it was left-wing, but there were still reasonable people there, reasonable thinkers. It wasn't just this unending barrage of left-wing propaganda. And so in the 20-plus some odd years between the current year and back in the day, it's safe to say that it's left wing is a bit of an understatement. It's far to the left. Now,
I would call it revolutionary progressive. That's a good term for it.
Revolutionary progressive, yeah. I like that, revolutionary. So That was your first, I guess you could say, awakening to what we've deemed to call the revolutionary progressive movement in American higher educational system. As far as, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to answer your question, but if you have
Please,
more,
no, please do answer. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, growing up in a more conservative household, I've been skeptical from it from day one. I was always told to take what they say, any instructor with a grain of salt. In terms of the first awakening, I can't pinpoint it, but one I can pinpoint was a recent discussion we had about history faculties across various universities, if you recall that one.
Yes.
And how that's changed over the years, where you can't even have a medievalist who just is looking to instruct on plain, normal, simple medievalism. It has to be about women's roles, or I don't even recall the others. You may recall it better than me.
Homosexuality, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, homosexuality and medievalism, that's another good one. So even history departments, for example, based on their hiring, it's very clear that they're looking for people who talk about niche groups ad nauseum in the medieval context. And it doesn't matter whether it's medieval or not. It's any sort of brand of history. Rarely will you see, going through these faculties, you'll see about 20, 30, maybe 40% of the faculty what you would classify as normal historians, and the other ones have various focuses on revolutionary progressivism.
Now, in terms of the actual coursework, how did this I mean, you'd take an interest in this group. It turned out to be effectively a propagandist organization for integrating so-called refugees. But inasmuch as the revolutionary progressive movement is afoot in universities, almost certainly you would have seen direct evidence in terms of the coursework you were taking. So for example, did you engage in any history courses where this became evident?
Yes, I have, exactly. That's why it comes up as the first example. Now, I mean, it takes a very different character than what the Red Guard students are doing. It's been this way in universities, I would say, since the dawn of time. I think most people will acknowledge, especially in more liberal arts, the point of, at least that's how I've learned to operate the system over the years, how you survive and get through those classes is by writing whatever the professor tells you or what you think they want to hear. And that is the pathway to good grades. So, for example, this is a rookie mistake, but in the past I have written major term papers, trying to cultivate my own ideas, and those receive a D, even though they have numerous sources behind them, and I would argue they're well constructed, versus later ones I've done where I've adjusted it to what I think the professor wants to hear and what they want to say, with no sources provided whatsoever. I didn't cite a single source, and then you go from a D to a B plus to an A. And so you kind of see it's almost like a Darwinian force where it completely stifles independent thought just by realizing that you have to get through the system that way, particularly in the liberal arts. And by the way, that's a separate issue entirely from the fact that the instruction itself is clearly propaganda too.
As far as the specificities are concerned, if you don't mind divulging maybe some of the specifics of the types of history classes you've taken, and how you perceive them to be perhaps done differently than one would normally expect of an overview course, as it were.
Yeah, they're survey courses. That's the irony.
Right. Yes. Well, they're survey courses, but they do not appear in form and packaging as survey courses. Instead, they appear, by the lights of what you've told me, to be propaganda. Now, any specific examples of this would be very helpful in illustrating this point.
Yes, happy to oblige. You would think a survey course would be a survey of the subject matter at hand, but I have had experiences where people are in upper-level survey courses about specific countries, and being frank, because you've mentioned this on previous videos, I'll say it again here, one of which was about Germany. And the professor, who in many ways was seeking to propagandize the students, was realizing that his attempts were falling on people who weren't really receptive to it just by the nature of their own lack of interest and probably lack of cognitive abilities as well. So at one point he passed out a sort of a litmus test of sorts. He wanted to gauge people's basic knowledge of German history, and then one of them was identify where Germany was on a map of Europe in 1914. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a majority, but about 10%, 15% were not able to identify Germany on a map in an upper level history course. Now, but getting in terms of propaganda,
if I might ask a brief question, would you say that this particular subpopulation, constituted what we might call the dude bro or the dude sister?
Well, ostensibly they're in an upper level history course, but in appearance and mentality, yeah, I would argue about a third, maybe even a fourth were like that.
So and from I'm recalling things you told me that these types of people would even engage with the professors in a way that along the lines, hey, bro, professor, bro, like, I didn't fucking, like, do that shit, like, that assignment. Is that all right, bro? Like, that sort of thing.
You do, you exaggerated a little bit. Like, none of them, I have seen professors be referred to as bro, which I'm sure in your time would have never flown.
No.
But I can't say they ever would be as egregious in saying, I didn't read that shit. They will joke to each other, and I participated in this too. They'll joke to each other and say that to each other, but thankfully not too much about the professor. I mean, we've talked about this too. They will, however, refer to the reading material openly to professors as boring and hard to navigate through. In fact, I just had an experience with that very recently, where the professor was condescendingly saying, I won't say condescending, I'll attribute better motives and intentions to him, but he was saying, this reading material was very difficult to navigate through, wasn't it? And I couldn't help but smile. And he noticed me when I did that, and he said, like, oh, you're smiling, so yeah, it was definitely difficult, right? And I said, no, it particularly wasn't. And it took him by surprise for a second. Is every other time, particularly in that semester, people, the only way they connect with the professor in terms of discussion of the course materials, particularly in a historical context, was, oh yeah, that reading was hard, man. Yeah. And you spend the first 15 minutes of a discussion of, as they would like to say, scholarship, just talking about how difficult it was to read. I can't see how this system is serving people on both fronts, whether it's by serving just by the fact that you sit around the table talking about how this stuff is hard to read, as they would say. This stuff is really hard to read, man. And then the other half is revisionist propaganda.
Yeah, and I seem to recall in learning some of the new lexical tools available to the
yes, I'm happy to assist them.
Dude sister culture that even in presenting official reports to the professor, some of these people, particularly the females, would use terminology such as dead ass or low key? Yes.
Low key, not dead ass.
Right.
There's nuance.
There's nuance, right? It was such as ex historical person from Germany was like totally like low key something.
Yes, Bismarck low key was looking to suppress Catholics. I'm sure you're aware of this. Low key though.
Yeah. So there's already a kind of generational disconnect in the discourse between the people in the class and the professor.
Right, and they're that way long before they arrive in those courses. So that's a separate issue in of itself.
Right, but as far as the content is concerned, now as we said or discussed earlier, a survey course was modern German history, if I recall. You're supposed to learn about the history of modern Germany.
Correct.
Did you, while participating, get the sense that you were being subjected to unbiased and relatively objective instruction on the events that unfolded to make modern Germany, or did it all have a certain slant or direction that the professor wanted to take things in?
The latter of the two, and I think slant is too gentle of a word. I think you're being shoved down the slide, going all the way to the bottom. I mean, to the point where if someone in the class were to ask a question opposing the professor's view, which I'll get into in a moment, he would openly challenge them and debate them for considering something else. Now, specifically in the context of the German history class, you are correct. And how this was expressed was that the entire class was about German anti-Semitism, or the Jewish, or as I like to say, the Semitic experience in the German context. That's what the class should have been about. The entire thing was about how Jews had it rough before the First World War, during the First World War, during the Second World War, between the two wars, after, through and through. And that was the entire point of it. And this is a symptom of hiring faculties that are specializing in, systems of oppression or, minorities in the context of greater historical events. And so when you hire people who are, about like only the female experience in the colonial context or anti-Semitism in the German context, that is how the courses are reflected, to the point where you cannot enroll in a normal, standard, particularly European survey course of history without it being for a specific purpose, discussing a specific, rather looked down upon part of history. Now, you can still get that. We've talked about this. You can still get normal African survey course histories, because I think for the most part, like, the chairs of the department stay out of that. They let them do whatever they want. For example, the Asian history courses, like Chinese and all the rest, they're taught by typically, Chinese faculty members as well, and they're not interested in this crap. I mean, they probably have the same concept of the white left. I think that Black Pigeon Speaks was investigating in recent videos. I forget the term for it. So any courses, I will say, you can still get a normal, traditional historical experience in those classes, at least in terms of what you learn, in any context but European, and also I will add on to that too, New World, Atlantic as well. Those are the two areas where you can't really receive a neutral standard instruction on the major flashpoints of history. It's very interesting.
It's interesting because, a basic survey class, in theory, if you're trained in a period of time, a period of history in a specific country, giving a survey shouldn't be a very difficult thing to do, because you're basically giving an overview of what appear to us to be sequential events that are interconnected and related to each other. But for some reason, this particular gentleman who was instructing...
Who's not alone, by the way.
Who's not alone, by the way, could not do this. And you said, well, his particular obsession was, I take it, anti-Semitism?
You call it obsession. I mean, obviously that was his focus of scholarship, I think, as he would put it.
Well, right.
Borderline that, though, definitely. And it seemed redundant to me because, I mean, I would say, so for example, I mean, we're going to backtrack here, but, history instruction throughout the years of elementary and middle school and high school is the same thing. You go through the same cycle of history generally, and it's both American-centric and also pretty lopsided. So you go like, okay, there was the Revolution, and then there was the Civil War, it was fought over slavery, forget all the other context and nuance to it. And then the turning point of the Second World War was D-Day, and then also there was a Holocaust, and the Americans let the Soviets take Berlin, which I find ridiculous, but that's what's taught in school, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you learn the same thing over and over, and you learn about the Holocaust, specifically about, I would say, you probably, as a normal American student in the public school system all the way through university, learn about the Holocaust probably 9 to 10 times in a row across the years. I would think maybe 2 or 3 would suffice, certainly. And then also, too, when you make it to the university level, it might be fine to get basic instruction in earlier stages of education in public school. But when you go to a university, you want to, branch out beyond those things. But what you find are these survey courses that are presented as survey courses, but in reality, what they is sets of coursework and instruction about how a specific ways Europeans were terrible, or the experiences of a specific minority group, and not so much about the basic foundational historical knowledge itself.
So in that class, what did you learn about, say, 19th century Germany? I mean, which is very important for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I mean, and to give some credit, you hit the basic points. But I read about these in books when I was much younger. But you hit the big markers. You hit unification 1871. The Kaisers, obviously Chancellor Bismarck and his importance, et cetera, et cetera. So you hit those big points. However, 90% of the time of which was spent examining anti-Semitic postcards, anti-Semitic cartoons. But I'm not meaning to disparage that, but it's a question of how much attention it receives. I mean, I don't recall the percentage of the population there were before the Second World War in Germany, but we'll pick a number, maybe 10 or not 10, like 5% you say would be fair. Should not be 90% of the instruction, especially if the course is billed as a general survey course. And the anti-Semitism in terms of propaganda, like whether it be advertisements or postcards, were just a small part of it. The rest of it was talking about like these what the professor would bill as proto-fascist movements, like I think the German Imperial League was the name of the other ones. A lot of these, for example, this is a European thing, so this concept is introduced to me. There used to be clubs where men would get together and discuss issues. Do you recall the names of them? They're considered underground now.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, women had issues with those too as well.
They were not allowed in. That's the reason. And also the nudist movement. I mean, that was interesting, but of course that had to be tacked on to what he would build them as early notions of Aryan racial superiority. For the fact that Germans like to during the interwar years be nudist and celebrate fitness and health and vigor. That was all construed into that concept.
Interesting. So basically, a survey class about modern German history, stretching from ostensibly in the 19th century to the present, was all about Jews and anti-Semitism.
80%, 85%, yeah.
Right. What about moving forward? I mean, obviously, since it covered present events, in light of the great works of the Chancellor of Germany, who in reverent wisdom and her amazing ability to delegate things, decided in changing certain policies. What was his reaction to that?
Which Chancellor are you referring to, Merkel?
Yes, the Honorable Frau Merkel.
I'm very happy you asked about that. Ostensibly, the course was supposed to end with the termination of the GDR in the early 90s, but of course, it didn't quite stop there because it didn't, right? So, among all the things that could have been discussed, what was discussed was how we received this presentation quite forcefully about how Germany is a multicultural nation now, and if anyone doesn't like it, they can put up and shut up, and that is the reality. And it was very interesting. So, for example, changes in crime rates in the new Germany, the Germany of today, were examined. But what was interesting is what we were instructed and shown were statistics on increase of hate crimes in Germany, and the rise of what he would call fringe far-right parties. So, for example, he was showing a trend of again, hate crime attacks in Germany, one of which was a firebombing of a major refugee center, I believe in the 90s. It was famous. I don't recall the name of it. You may know that better than I. But that was examined, but no examination was given to, the changes in street crimes and sexual assaults, stemming from new arrivals to Germany. It was the only side that was examined was, the domestic response among the more agitated people in Germany. And then it went a step further, which is, I'll have to think very carefully about how to say this. Rather than, taking any pretense of being scholarship whatsoever, we were outright shown these little mini documentaries from the New York Times about, I think, a Ghanan fellow who clearly, had mental disabilities of some kind, and he was participating in, I think, a drama club in Germany, and it was a big presentation on woe is me, I get nasty looks on the subway station. And the larger point I'm going to tie this to is that we did receive, by the way, there was no Interestingly enough, there was no discussion portion on this part, but we did receive an examination of the major cultural and social changes happening in Germany, but it was both myopic and entirely focused on one side's response and then not the other side's response. And that struck me. That struck me as very inherently lopsided.
Yeah. And he seemed very concerned about the present state of Germany.
Yes, I recall a specific after I think the most recent were they parliamentary or state elections in Germany late last year. The ones were the AfD. The parliamentary elections in Germany. He strutted into class and he asked, how many of you know what just happened in Germany? And of course, almost no one knew, as is typical with, as you would say, dude bros.
Was anyone drinking a pumpkin spice latte at the time by chance?
I did not take an inventory of what people were drinking. I apologize for failing on that front. And so, long story short, he said he was concerned about the election results in Germany, that they were very concerning, which is interesting. You think you would take a more dispassionate look at it, but that's what happened. And again, tying this to the larger theme of our talk that I think we're trying to get at here is these courses are not free. They're not free. Some people incur debt to go into universities through the student loans program in the United States. And I'm not really equipped to talk about that racket. That's a whole another video in itself. But people are either paying to receive blatant propaganda, assuming they're intelligent enough to discern that, or even going into debt to receive ideological instruction and blatant propaganda, which I find fascinating. At least in the liberal arts universes. STEM, I mean, there's a million videos on how STEM is changing too, but it's a different ballgame, obviously. But, this is one thing that continues to amaze both you and I, that people pay to be propagandized.
Well, it does amaze me. And this isn't the only piece of evidence. I mean, it's not as if this modern German history class was a one-off thing.
No, but it is emblematic.
Well, of course it's emblematic, but you have additional experience.
Yeah, we could spend the next 3 hours. I mean, we're talking about the culmination of many, many years in and out of this and doing various things. And again, I mean, tying it back to the bigger point, we can go into specifics.
Right.
This is the case in every single study of political science, international affairs, history, any major, even philosophy. Any major liberal arts study in any sort of European, historical or political context will be presented in that way. The only way you can get a traditional way of instruction is by studying the other major cultural centers of gravity, because they don't care about this crap.
So what other, for example, historical experiences have you had where the impression was a propagandist one, that they were just trying to talk about something that is not, in fact, the entirety of the historical issue or the survey, but really sort of micro focus on that?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, another classic example is, as we alluded to before, any sort of like New World history. It can be billed as Atlantic history, colonial history, however you want to present it, is the same thing. Whether it be, anti-Semitism in Germany being 85% of the instruction on German history, 85 to 90% of colonial, whether it be Spanish, English, French, or whatever, is on the experiences of slavery. Which, I mean, I think you and I both know that there are so many fascinating things you could talk about instead of that, or maybe in addition to that. The roles of genetic admixture between the people, diseases, the fact that the role of like the tides and the trade winds, and how like some places were colonized before others, and the great interexchange of biological entities between continents. You could talk about that.
The nature of mercantilism as it existed at the time.
Yeah, very fascinating, newly minted economic systems. Yeah. All of which is put to the side in favor of let's learn the year that certain slaves arrived at certain points and what was done to them. And you're an intelligent and discerning person. You can clearly see the angle to that. It's meant to evoke a certain emotional response and a certain way of thinking, rather than understanding the historical context as it is. And it has to leave people utterly unprepared for actual investigation and scholarship. But if you really think about it on the macro level, I mean, maybe that is the point. The point is to create more propagandists to fill out the ranks of the academic institutions, rather than people who actually understand.
Yeah. Huh. Do you think I mean, given the somewhat dilapidated state of the student body and their affiliations with the cult of the dude bro, do you think anyone else picks up on this, or do you find yourself this sort of lost at sea here, in the sense that you're the only one stranded out there and everyone else is sort of so poorly equipped to pick up on these things that it ultimately doesn't matter to them?
Right. It varies from place to place. Obviously, I have been to many of university. I've been to tier 3, tier 2, and I've been around tier 1. Never been enrolled in them, obviously, but it varies definitely. It depends on the caliber of people. I like assigning universities in the United States into the 3-tier, 4-tier system, where tier 1 is the greatest quality, and then tier 4 is perceived to be lower quality. Now, that's very hard to discern your question as to people's receptiveness or reaction to that, because I mean, one thing anyone who goes to school in any context in the United States will readily tell you is that it is an experience of, if you are right-leaning at all or have contrarian viewpoints or whatever, it is an exercise of maintaining hidden and clandestinely trying to navigate your way through the system. If anyone else is aware, they don't let it on. I mean, everyone's very well practiced in getting along to go along. In fact, one thing I'm very proud of myself is, I've had professors and obviously various instructors all over the years think that I'm actually the star student in terms of agreeing with them, but all it was an exercise in writing what they want you to say, and then also playing a good devil's advocate for things you don't believe in. And so really it's an exercise to the more capable among us, I think, an exercise in chameleonship rather than what you were alluding to.
Yeah. I can't help but think that the nature of the student body is such that even if the propagandist nature of the material being taught could be challenged, these are not the people that challenge it, if you know what I mean.
No, the people that challenge it, ironically, are the people who are autodidacts, who explore these things on their own, right? So, for example, a majority of my knowledge of all various I'll use the same term again, liberal arts affairs, comes from outside reading and outside investigation, not a drop of which was helped in the instructional context. You do that to effectively obtain your piece of paper and your certification so you can go on to other things. Autodidacts, I would say, are the only challenge to it. Everyone else is either a chameleon, believes it, or is like the proles in 1984. They don't care. They're just getting along. They're looking forward to the next Friday.
Interesting. Yeah. And I imagine the sense is that this is just getting worse and worse. People enroll in these classes, unlike you, say in the case of modern German history, because they suit some need to fill a requirement more than anything else, right? And then
Correct.
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter if it's propaganda or not. It's the only that matters is that they pass the test or whatever.
Show up on time, turn in the things at the right times, etc. It's paper moving.
Yeah. And with that kind of attitude, I don't see what hope there is, because these people aren't even in a position to. Now, you mentioned that somebody had actually challenged the German history professor on something, at least, and he was shot down, or
very stridently. I think that would be the word choice. The specific context of which was that the professor was asserting that any sort of resistance to Hitler and the Nazis was trivial, almost not even worth investigating, and by no means a way of absolving anyone. And then this person brought up, as Tom Cruise portrayed in the movie, Operation Valkyrie, and the attempt of the German military junta, the Prussian officers, to depose Hitler. And that derailed everything, and went on to a 15-minute discussion about why I don't even know why I say that. It was one-sided, about why he was wrong, and he vigorously disagreed with him. So the point of classes like that is to anyone who is not a chameleon and will say something or offer a critical view. The point is to identify them and shut them down as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So the faith in terms of hope, you alluded to that in the question, I think is from from people outside. Again, the people explored on their own, people, maybe even people from other countries, and autodidacts. I mean, we have to remember too, there's this belief in the United States that everyone should go to university, which I disagree with. A lot of these people who are being propagandized under an older system or an older way would not be going to university or would not be studying these things. And under a different way, this would not be happening to them. So I see them there. I see them sitting in those rooms as a result of an artificial push, an artificial attempt at social engineering to run everyone through the university system rather than by actual natural forces.
Are you suggesting that a person who's the equivalent of the Rad Brad probably shouldn't be at university?
No, I think it's bad for all parties. Except for maybe the people who are paid to instruct them and propagandize them. They're misled with expectations of how they're going to end up as a result of it. I would say you're wasting their critical developmental years in terms of developing marketable skills. And they're being trained for just utterly useless crap other than hoping that they get through to the graduate school system so that they can become upper tier political activists. In fact, graduate school students I actually would like to get to because that's an even more advanced level of what happens in these undergraduate survey level courses. But to put a bow nicely on that question, no, the Rad Brad should not be discussing the biological interchange between the four continents and the Atlantic system. I think he's fooling himself. I think he's being fooled, and I think it's a waste of the time and a misallocation of cognitive ability trying to instruct people like that.
Yeah,
hate to be elitist, but I think you would agree with me.
Oh yeah, as you probably know, I've talked about this quite often on my channel. The notion that university education is a universal and should be provided for everyone. The irony is the real Rad Brad, not the symbolic one who probably might end up sitting next to you in any given class, was wise enough to recognize that he was just ill-equipped to go to university and instead does PS4 playthroughs and makes a lot of money doing it. Props.
I'm very glad you brought that up. Yeah, the Rad Brad is how it should be, where you recognize, I mean, unfortunately, only the lower tier, I would say, people who academically perform in school actually have to go through that decision process because the standards for getting into university these days are, as we've talked about, non-existent.
Right.
Now, with the Rad Brad, what he did, I mean, not everyone obviously can be a YouTube entertainer, but what he did is what people should be doing. Most people should be doing. When you get out of college, when you get out of high school, which unfortunately you're not taught any marketable skills there anyway, but there's still time, right? You get out of high school, you throw yourself into the job market, and as like he did. I mean, joke all you want about the Rad Brad and how he goes, oh yeah, bro, for real, bro. He learned to edit. He learned probably good content strategies. He probably learned the basic tenets of SEO and all those things. He has marketable skills. The Rad Brad, I think, is more of a benefit to the economy than someone being propagandized to be part of the political machine.
Yeah.
The actual Rad Brad, not the archetypal.
Yeah, of course. I mean, although they're pretty numerous, and then there's the female equivalent who always seems to make it to class on time with a latte in hand and a mobile phone in the other.
Yeah, actually, maybe you could talk about this. But I mean, going through the examples, drinking loudly in class, going on Netflix and Facebook and typing on your laptop to your girlfriend on your computer, texting in class, saying "yeah, bro" to the professor, or laughing to their face about not reading the material, or how it was boring, etc. Tell me about how that would have flown in your day, and then tell me about certain experiences with the professors you had, or it was the opposite, where you were intimidated by them.
Yes. Well, I can. I'm not sure if I should start with the more mild examples. I had a Western history professor who would not brook that sort of behavior.
Stop him right there, by the way. There's no such thing as a Western history professor anymore. But anyway, please continue.
Well, in my day there was.
I know.
He was an Egyptologist by trade, but he was very well versed in both ancient and medieval history and fairly well versed in modern history. And so he taught an introduction to Western civilization from its inception in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians all the way down to roughly the end of the Renaissance. It was meant to be a survey course for the uninitiated. And the prototype of the dude bro at the time did exist. He tended to wear his baseball cap upside down, or backwards. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking of the German term.
Some things never change.
Backwards. Always slightly faded and dirty because you never wanted to wash the baseball cap. That would take away the effect. And and there was a type of female who was referred to as the Jap. I mean, technically that stands for Jewish American Princess, but they weren't all, obviously, of the tribe. It was just sort of a prototype, rather, of, like, oh my God, that sort of person. And they would, of course, tag along and follow the prototype dude bros with their turnaround baseball caps that were somewhat faded and dirty to maintain the effect. And every now and then, these types of people would be disruptive in the class, and they would be shut down. If it happened more than once, they would be ejected from the class. That was mild. I had several Latin professors, 3 in total, but one of them, one I had for my beginning years of studying Latin, was, without exception, the most draconian teacher or instructor I'd ever encountered. He had no mercy. If you made a mistake, he would point it out. If you made the mistake more than once, he might laugh at you. A third time, he would ask why you're at university at all. This man would reduce young men, advanced teenagers, to crying. I happened to be the second best student in the class, so I was rarely subject to this, although I'm ashamed to admit I was outdone by a Russian Jewess in that class. But nonetheless, that guy was just absolutely vicious. He also had a hard-on for female participants. He was a bit biased in that regard. So if you were a male and you didn't do very well in that class, he had it in for you. I mean, he would crack the whip, and if people were disruptive one time, he'd eject you from the class. There were no second chances. It was extremely strict.
Now, to interject, now imagine that versus you're told to discuss the content you're supposed to read, and everyone sitting around at the table is completely silent because they either don't know what to say or didn't read a single word of it. How would that go down in a class like that?
It would have been grounds for failure, because you would have, so for example, I took several, I almost ended up minoring in history. I mean, technically I had enough credits to accumulate that, but so I took a course on early modern history with a specific focus on France, namely the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And we would have discussion groups, I recall, every Thursday, and you had to do, perhaps not elaborate, but a bit of reading in preparation. And if you didn't do that, not only would you look like a fool, you couldn't do anything, and everyone had to participate. So, and this was a time before you didn't have the mobile at the ready or the latte at the ready either. So you couldn't just sort of act like a ditz and kind of smile your way out of it. Even the jappiest of females would have to, in theory, do something. They didn't really contribute much, and of course, oftentimes, because they were females, they were shown clemency in a way that the males were not. But even then, it was there was no tolerance for that sort of thing. Same applied to ancient Greek, and basically every other class that I took. And then studying other countries, I mean, none of this would have been well, it really depended, but the old school professors never tolerated this sort of thing. There was no disruption, and many a young, ignorant student was made a fool in front of the eyes of the many, because they either had not prepared or simply didn't understand something and didn't bother to ask. And so, it was different. This is 20 plus years ago. This is not centuries ago. We're not talking about a huge transition. This is why I've pointed out previously
how things change,
how rapidly things have changed. Now, I can't judge maybe in some of the easier, well, actually that's not even true. I mean, even a class on Shakespeare, which was awful. This was, even in my day, it was run by some feminist hag who was sporting one chin too many. It was pretty bad, but you still had to do the work. And even back then, I remember writing essays for that class, and in forming my own analysis and being honest, I was punished for it, and so I had to switch to the standard propaganda. So even back then in the 90s...
Yeah, some things never change.
Well, I think it was just that even certainly by the 90s, there already had been that view of literature for the most part. There were a few exceptions.
Literature has been a lost cause for quite a while.
Yeah, but in the more traditional fields, such as ancient or medieval history, of course, on that it was different. I mean, in fact, even I remember one guy who we were studying the sort of the classics of literature, the Homeric epics and Dante, and it was very by the books. It was a standard analysis. We learned a lot, of course, but there was none of this feminist thing. But he was a male, and obviously there were some other things involved there. I'd say by and large it was not nearly as bad back then, save for a few subjects such as English literature, perhaps. Got a whiff of that in modern German literature, although I wasn't forced to take too much of that. So there was a openly gay professor who liked to pontificate about issues he found compelling.
You're describing an alien world to me. That's what you're describing.
Yeah.
You're talking about grounds for failure. I think it's a win if there's one or two people in the lecture hall who actually read the material and are able to hold up the class part of the discussion. You're hoping that, at least many of these people, they're hoping that one or two of these people single-handedly hold up the entire thing. And I imagine in your day, probably there would be more participation, but there would probably only be one or two high-caliber participants. Here, you have one or two participants, period. It doesn't even matter how high caliber or not. I mean, they might say, that reading was really hard. I mean, I don't know. It was pretty rough, man.
Yeah, bro, that shit was really hard, man. It took me like 4 hours to read that thing, man. I think... I certainly tended, depending on the content, to be one of the more active participants. I would ask many questions, often, sometimes, to the consternation of the professor if he was in the flow of things.
You're there to gain access to information you never normally would. I mean, also, this was probably pre-internet as well. Right?
Yeah, and so I learned, obviously, I had a background in European history to some degree, taught to myself and to some degree my father. And my father has long had you could say a small library of somewhat musty old tomes that decorate the shelves of the flat, and I would these were things written in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but I would devour them when I was a teenager and a youth, and so I had some background. But I was there to get an education, to learn about the things that I thought were relevant. Although, of course, even then it was billed as sort of get this piece of paper to get you a job. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but I should point out that even Generation X, my generation, was already subject to some of the misguided notions, if we want to be generous in our phraseology here, that the idea being that if you have a degree, you'll be fine, assuming you do reasonably well, or even if you don't do well, because there's a job out there. Everyone bought into that. My parents bought into it. They propagandized me. The school counselors bought into this. The professors, to some degree, bought into this. They were of a different generation. I bring this up because I was recently in the cafe, which is a name I use for a certain Discord server. Some people might recognize which one. I need not disclose that. And I was assailed by an 18-year-old from Sweden who was at once incorrectly characterized me as a boomer, and then upon the revelation that I wasn't, blamed me for being the recipient of boomer wisdom and the silent generation's wisdom, and somehow propagating that further. No. I was as much a quote-unquote victim as anyone else. In fact, when I finished my degree, the only thing I could end up doing was teaching, which is basically what I ended up doing for a while, because the market was
among the first victims.
Yeah. I would say that once the mid-'90s hit, the notion that university, the presence and education received at university was a marketable thing. Not necessarily skill, but you could get a job with it, barring nepotism or connections. This was an illusion by then. This was no longer the case, and so we bought into it. We were fed this information, and in many ways, the current generation is much better equipped to realize these things because it's so much more transparent, and it's also so much more obvious that that's not the case. Whereas in our day, or rather in my day, it wasn't clear at all. It was the idea that you finish your degree and all of a sudden you should have a job lined up for you, as it was in the 60s, the 50s, and the 70s, etc. Not so. But nevertheless, the intention was to get an education. Of course, there were people there who were not there to get an education, but rather a degree, say in business management, and they might be forced to take X class and they have no interest. These did tend to be the dude bros with the turned around, faded, somewhat dirty baseball caps. But there were more people who were interested. Certainly in the classics, there was no tolerance for failure, and certainly disruption would not have been tolerated. Lack of preparedness, et cetera, et cetera. These things were just not concepts. You had to put in the work at a minimal level, at least. And I remembered spending many hours, sometimes pulling all-nighters, in sheer terror of the opprobrium I might have received had I not done proper preparation for the translation of some Cicero text or Caesar's Gallic Wars or whatever it might have been, because if I had not done the work, despite my reasonable talent in the area, I would have been eviscerated in front of everyone. Standards have definitely devolved, to say the least. I
felt the way you felt doing that from time to time over the years, but on the most part, that's largely gone. It's a shame, though, because what you're talking about could be very easily reinstituted. I mean, I think the number one thing that drives people to perform, as you were saying, is what you were going through: fear of embarrassment, fear of being singled out, fear of being chastised, versus today, where it's like, what did you think of the reading? Was it hard?
Oh, yeah, man, it was really hard, dude. Yeah, man, like 4 hours to fucking finish like 12 pages, man. It was fucking hard, man.
In fact, I just had an experience very recently where I was discussing a previous course I was enrolled with one of these people. He actually literally had a backwards baseball cap on, and I know it still happens. And by the way, he was in business management.
I see.
So some things never change. Some things do change. And he was saying, "Oh yeah, I mean that class, I didn't even read anything. Like I read one book on the way to the test. I mean, that was it." So people, in brazenness, I mean, when the professor is across the room, we'll say that they no. In his defense, he was talking about another class, though. I imagine if you were the professor listening, that would be indicative of your behavior in that class.
Didn't you tell me also that there was some flippant female who openly said, "Yeah, like it was like totally boring," out loud to the professor or something?
Yeah. This is another one of those classic. I don't know why they insist on doing this. For why don't you all just sit around on your tables and discuss the scholarship and the reading material? And what that, as I mentioned before, what that normally amounts to is 4 or 5 people sitting in silence around each other. Absolutely nothing to say. But
right.
Anyway, getting to this specific example, the classic question was thought, well, what did you think of the reading material? It was really boring. And then aghast, the professor is on it. Boring. This is some really important scholarship.
Right.
And I've told you the story a million times, but so some of you may think this is boring, but this is really important scholarship. And I spoke to this person later, and what they said to me was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that, but I don't know, I feel like we hit it off right. I feel but I'm really worried low key he knows I don't to read anything, but I still feel we've got a good connection."
Yeah. Well, I think another thing that's indicative of the caliber of the person who's entering university, I guess you could say that you and I are, at least for the time being, retired from the Overwatch scene. We've made great strides in this direction. But one of the few joys that we did derive from that somewhat awful game was the interactions we would have with the very simian-like people we would encounter, who, you know, it would beg our belief sometimes. And I think these are the types of people that will end up at university inevitably,
They do.
all the time, doing these things.
Yeah, that stupid Hanzo. He's right next to me. That's what gets me to show up to class, hoping for these novel experiences with people.
Well, right. I mean and this is the problem, that there's no interest in the class per se, because it's all propaganda anyway. And whilst you might learn something you didn't know about some specific aspect of something, that's not really the highlight. It's usually the clowns who inhabit the landscape with you, and you're just kind of looking for that occasional highlight of what. It's the same thing as Overwatch, but you're not playing it for the content. The content's horrible, and the people who play it make it even worse, just like the classes you're taking. But every now and then there's something funny that happens, and it almost justifies your participation in the match, just as spending tens of thousands of dollars these days justifies sitting in a classroom filled with propaganda. So, you know, Anna might slurp her pumpkin spice latte and talk about how low key she actually did in fact get along with the professor.
I could not agree more.
It's the analogy is uncanny, and I think the real issue, if we're frank, is what I call the educational industrial complex. It's just one of those many churning, cumbersome bureaucracies in the United States that is relentlessly pushed forward, that we know is not particularly effective, or maybe you and I and some other people, and perhaps even the bureaucrats and the politicians know it too, but it's so deeply ingrained in the infrastructure of society now that everybody goes to university, and if you can't afford it, don't worry, because daddy government's going to give you a lot of money that you'll have to pay back later on. You probably won't be able to ever pay it back in total because of the interest rates and other things. But hey, you can go to university now and get your degree in psychology. And so that's probably the biggest problem. People are incentivized, whether they're capable or not of going to university, because they're given the means, at least temporary means, to do it. If you cut them off at the purse strings, maybe they would end up more like Rad Brad, which, you know, I don't watch Rad Brad, but I know he does well, and for what he does, he's decent at it, and, you know, maybe Dude Bro Brad at university could do something similar. And
I think it's a waste of cognitive talent, to quickly interject. People who fix up your car or do any sort of these other more physical occupations, I would prefer like the cognitive ability is put into those areas, so that, you know, you can work with people who are competent and you know well and you can trust, rather than like leaving those areas to the even lower ends of the spectrum. I think it's being wasted. Now, actually, one thing I do really want to get into is what is the end result? Because, I mean, you can marvel at the wonderful inefficiencies and the crazy elements of it, but I do think like this entire system is for a very specific purpose, and the purpose of that is to produce four types of people. And not everyone makes it to one of these four types of people, but I've seen it. So the first of which are the lower tier political activists, like the people who always write those snazzy or very quick-witted BuzzFeed articles or blog posts or political articles on the internet that help propagandize people. You do need above average intelligence people to create those, especially if they're towing the political line. And that's usually expressed by people who make it through the graduate school program. So, for example, I was assisting a friend in creating their master's dissertation. And of course, that requires going through a great many studies, primarily many of which were required through JSTOR. And this was involving, I believe, health sciences, believe it or not, health sciences. So that's a soft science, I would say, or even one of the more hard sciences. And I was reading through, and every study, I mean, as you know, there's always a section where you list your limits and weaknesses of the study, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the entire section of that study was devoted to, this study is weak because we did not consider systems of repression. This study is weak because it may have overvalued, whatever the word is, like, white Americans, blah, 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 stuff like that. And I was surprised by that. There's not much that surprises me anymore. Like that sort of blatant political dialogue and narratives being pushed right into the weakness section of a published paper in an academic journal. It floored me. It floored me.
Yeah.
And that's what it dawned on me, that the purpose of people who are going through graduate school are to be useful functionaries of the pretty much the Democratic Party, the party organs and systems. If you wanted to say something, I can hold off before we go to
Yeah,
the
I just
other
want to briefly
three
mention that this is somewhat related. That the late C.S. MGTOW once told me a story about how he had some doctor friends that they would have female colleagues that basically got their names on papers for performing fellatio. That's pretty much
That doesn't
it.
surprise me. That's interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is what you get so used to all these things, much like Overwatch, until there's always that rare event where you think, oh, that's a new way of throwing the game, something like that. This is a new way of mucking up the system. It's the same principle.
Yeah, it's a little different, but it's a big case of the tragedy of the commons, but in many ways not so much. Now, the other types of people produced by the university systems, again, are people who are ideologically correct and in the straight direction, so you can fill out the ever-growing state bureaucracy. I mean, I don't care if you're working in the Department of Agriculture or you're a social worker or whatever, they want you to have the correct political disposition. And I really think it's designed, especially these liberal arts ones, designed to create people to fill out those all those various functions and organs of the state. Because none of those jobs really require a college degree. You're not required to, for example, know like all these various aspects of history, but it's a cognitive test of sorts. And when you're done by the end of it, you've done in your time, you put in your time, and you prove if you've made it through the undergraduate and graduate system. I mean, the only way you can survive is by towing the line. I mean, let's be honest about that. By expressing the correct opinions. By the time you're done, you're certified. They know that you're not going to cause trouble.
Yeah.
Is that's what it produces. Anyone who speaks out or develops their own ideas or has the wrong opinion, you won't make it. You won't make it. And so it's a great filter. It's a great filter to create bureaucrats and state functionaries.
Yeah. Let's pass us the glory of the world. I think this is
lower tier ones. The upper tier ones are part of the private school system, which is an entirely different story.
True, but I think there's a uniformity, whether private or public, in the United States at least, that, in terms
of course.
Yeah, they all have the same goals. They're all extremely left leaning. There's no balance. And this is part of the project that Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist at NYU, is working on, this heterodoxy academy, to get scholars and academics from both perspectives, left, right, centrist, etc., many different, together to at least find some common ground and to fight the current hegemony of the left. I don't see this changing anytime soon. If your experience is any way to gauge it, I think everyone's will be in for a rough ride for some time to come on this particular front.
One of the last things I want to touch on are people trying to meaningfully change this great and interesting system, and I would argue that no one really is. I mean, the first people who would come to mind are people like Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, the former Milo Yiannopoulos, and maybe Jordan Peterson to a lesser extent. But being particularly honest about them, many of these people are political opportunists. It can be entertaining to watch conservative pundits debate or try to destroy leftists on YouTube, but most of them are charlatans recycling other people's ideas. They're trying to pander, they're trying to sell subscriptions, and most importantly, they'll show up at universities. Many of these talks, where they're talking about how messed up the education systems are, the point of those events are to market their books. It's not to actually create meaningful changes. And then for all their talk of free speech, they'll disavow their peers the moment they say something that could reflect badly on their sources of advertisement revenue. I think of the Faith Goldie issue with Jordan Peterson as an example of that. So there's no hope in something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think Peterson's take on that was that it's just too risky or whatever. I'm not going to, I have no interest in this one way or another.
Right.
But, yeah, I mean, I think the people, I've said this in recent videos, the people, including Peterson, the people who are capable, have the presence, the stage presence, one might call it, to actually address some of these issues and then gain the ear of the audience are not doing it. They're sort of dancing around the important issues. They're touching upon certain things, all within a very politically correct framework, and they do not want to go any further, understandably. I mean, Peterson makes more money than anyone else on Patreon, possibly with the exception of Philip DeFranco.
Still technically unconfirmed.
Technically unconfirmed, but yeah, Philip DeFranco. And when you're making that much money, why would you risk saying something risque? So all of these people who have the spotlight these days have a vested interest in not saying certain things. And indeed, in many cases, one of my more recent videos, a video about Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris, I think these people sincerely believe some of the stuff that they say. Sort of 80s, 90s style liberals, who believe in things that are just manifestly not true anymore. Or actually, they never had been, but they think it's useful to maintain the mirage. So, and universities aren't really helping in this capacity. The only thing left really is the internet, but the internet is a I'm still convinced that the wisdom of the ancients is something that is best transmitted by those who are recipients of the wisdom of the ancients. And it's hard to, that sort of thing, the kinds of professors I used to have, it's difficult to come by these days on the internet. I mean, yes, you can haphazardly learn about things, but there's no one really to guide you or to push you in a decent direction. Not
if you're looking for one person to do that, you're mistaken. You have to find your own way, kind of picking and choosing across the board.
There's no because of the nature of the propaganda, there's no type of mentor figure that you can lean on that will give you suggestions.
You're on your own.
Pardon me?
You're on your own if you're trying to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And I realize it's a daunting task, which is why, in spite of my distaste for the current generation at times, I understand that they are very much victims of history because society has abandoned them in favor of maintaining these illusions and the propaganda that you've described at length. And it's very difficult to break away from it. This is why a figure such as Jordan Peterson is so tempting to buy into as a kind of all-father type of figure who's going to tell you what to do with your life and fix your life. Just, the 5-step program, or I think it's 12 steps in his case. He has some book called 12 Things, I don't remember the exact title. And he's gonna show you the way. And yeah, to the benighted masses, that's a godsend. But it's not really their fault. So where to start to change this is a really good question, and one I don't have a good answer to. Allegedly, in fact, Peterson is starting an online university. That might be of some help, but with all the money he's been raking in. But I just don't
private
know.
Universities are quite the racket. It's going to put his Patreon to shame. Just watch.
Yeah, he's a businessman above all.
For-profit universities, man. That's where it is at.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that goes for him. But as you know, my view is that the world is in dire straits, and nobody seems to be willing to take into account some of these issues. So Peterson included, and a lot of these big shots that have made waves in the internet, YouTubers like Sargon and various other people who are just sort of, they like floating on the surface, and that's where it's comfortable, and it is there that they shall remain. So, yeah, this isn't really a good thing, but there's no easy way out, and you're fortunate in that you have an interest in modern history that preceded you actually taking these classes. Well, what if somebody actually thought it'd be interesting to learn about it and thought he might learn about it at university?
They would be naive and wrong.
Yeah.
That's not the way you do it. My knowledge of modern history and every other avenue of history that I pursued on my own will remain intact. This is a separate affair. Stepping back, what university is, to kind of sum this up with a nice little bow, as of right now, ignoring solutions is a very interesting vacation program where you pay for the private ones up to $45,000-$50,000 a year to kind of hang around. You have a bare minimum amount of work, but it's very easy to get through. I mean, most classes you can get through without even reading the material. Apparently, I see other people do it. I've even been known to do that a few times myself. And you get to hang around, interact with people. It's a good old time, and at the same time, you get to feel productive. You're working towards something. You're working towards that awesome piece of paper. So it's a fun place to chill out and remain hip. But in terms of what it used to be, where you would take the best of the best, where society could only, I mean, even before your time, where society could support maybe 0.5% of people preserving this knowledge and information and going into the humanities. It's obviously different than that, but it makes for an interesting vacation course while you feel like you're growing as an individual and expanding your knowledge base. Nothing that what it used to be, though.
Yeah, so that sounds like a pretty accurate summary. It's unfortunate, but we have to deal with reality as it is, and these are the times we're living in. So, yeah. Well, I think for the audience, if you're older, then you might have been a bit shocked, and if you're not shocked, then at the very least it's all unfamiliar. If you're of comparable age, it might be very familiar to you, and if you're not yet of university age, then do consider the possibility of attending a trade school or something useful, as opposed to spending tons of money to be indoctrinated, or at least be subject to indoctrination.
I hate to interject again, but my advice to people is that if you're at a tier 1 or 2 university, you probably could, using that educational background, ingratiate yourself to one of the major, party machines or one of the organs of government. So there is a path for you. I'm not going to say humanities are completely useless, but on the large part, if you're at those lower tiers or you're not particularly motivated, you would be better served by not going at all.
Interesting.
But please continue.
No, I'm just saying that there aren't many choices left, but those are the choices that are available. So anyway, I think we've covered most of the ground, from university to vague and not so vague similarities to the horror that we call Overwatch. So thank you for joining me, providing this information. I think it's the bird's eye hands-on experience is vital, because people then know what's going on. I do have older subscribers who are even older than I am who aren't familiar with this sort of thing. So, yeah, at least the information is out there, and people can do with it what they can and what they wish. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to laugh about it with you. And by no means do I suspect is my situation unique, but I hope it can be of use to some people. So thanks for having me on.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.